On the topic of Space Quest, a game series notorious for its relentless and hilarious ways to die, this is a good segue into deaths and consequences. Sierra is notorious for several things, which it gets a lot of flack for. Dead ends where you can't go back and you don't know if you're at a dead end, lots of deaths, and consequences for actions or inactions. The dead end thing we're in agreement on, but as for deaths, non-Sierra fans may complain about them, but they are among some of the funniest stuff people remember. We went out of our way to see them, and we didn't need an achievement system to entice us to do this. Fans have cataloged all the ways to die in Sierra games and posted compilations on YouTube. And to this day, I can't really think of any other games where I'll say, oh wait, before we move on, I want to try to kill myself here and see what happens.
Okay, you now have the unstable ordnance. Remember, it was your idea.
This is not to say Sierra didn't also misuse deaths, but I think the so-called lesson that game designers seemed to take away from this was that there should be no deaths. I think this has been taken way too far. Deaths can be useful to keep a player on a certain track or path, tension, to allow feedback on what they should do, to entertain. So I'm glad to see the return of deaths in King's Quest 2015, and there is one particular whimsical death that will give you an achievement. Without giving it away, there was something that felt very Sierra about it. Ah, good times. And critics who had been so negative about deaths serving no useful purpose changed their tune with the indie game Limbo, where the original concept was partly inspired by the idea of how to torment your character with painful and excruciating deaths. The critics praised the game for showing how deaths could be used to convey information instead of just being a penalty, and as gruesome as the deaths were, they were also designed to be entertaining. Sound familiar? But death is a small piece of a larger encompassing topic, consequences. What we want is agency. While death gives us the feeling that our choices matter, it doesn't allow us to continue playing. So offering real choices with real consequences later in the game, without halting our progress, is a very straightforward way of providing this. In King's Quest VI, there were multiple paths and multiple endings based on various things you may or may not have done. Yes, these kinds of choices mean the potential for failure and unhappy outcomes, but it reinforces that the player has true agency in the game. This raises the stakes and increases the potential that the game will more deeply engage the player. But the industry seems to have gone in the other direction. Other games have removed all deaths and consequences from games. This not only kills the sense of agency, but also kills the joy of achievement. Let's look at this sequence from Back to the Future from Telltale. You are trying to free Doc, and the driver, Kid Tannen, sees you and starts shooting at you with a gun. But you cannot die, and you cannot fail in the game. And this is telegraphed to the player pretty explicitly throughout the game design. So this whole setup that's supposed to create dramatic anxiety in me was a failure, because the game designers already telegraphed to me that there will be no bad consequences for me, ever. And I know there are no alternative paths that I could have taken that would have prevented this situation. Instead, I have done the worst thing the designers hoped I wouldn't do. Realize this, and show the silliness of the guy shooting at me with an endless number of bullets, and always missing. But more importantly, did I really accomplish anything, since the game wouldn't let me fail at all? The common excuse I hear used to justify this is that players don't want to be frustrated. Seriously? Kicking arcades, throwing controllers, smashing keyboards, profuse swearing are not staples of video game culture? Isn't challenge fundamentally the heart of what video games can do?
I love video games for this reason over all other art forms. They do a thing which no other art form does, right? No other art form does. You cannot be bad at watching a movie. You cannot be bad at listening to an album. But you can be bad at playing a video game, and the video game will punish you and deny you access to the rest of the video game. No other art form does this. You've never read a book, and 3 chapters in, the book has gone, what are the major themes of the book so far? You've gone, well, I don't know, I wasn't paying close to... Ah, Jesus, come on! Games do this all the time. I'll give you an example. A very famous game, very controversial game called Grand Theft Auto 4. Right? All of you have played a very controversial game, because at some point you could drag somebody to an alleyway and shoot them in the head. I never got to that bit. I got stuck on a bit. You had to steal a car and drive across the city and assassinate a guy in a train station. But he kept running away. So...
And it is important to emphasize, this isn't just with adventure games. The industry as a whole has been struggling with the notion of challenge. To make sure nobody is blocked, fake challenge has been introduced.
Wow, the static energy you built up discharged, frying Lard Boy's circuitry. Did you actually think of that, or was it just luck?
There, right? And what these games do is try to seem like there's still a challenge, but actually make it very easy, right? It's the dramatic presentation of non-difficult things as difficult. This is what games like God of War and Fable 2 do. Like, there'll be a lot of enemies that run up and surround you, and it's a big battle scene, but really you just like hit the button a couple times and a lot of them die, right? And if we take away all of the challenge, then people will see that, right? And they'll lose the sort of suspension of disbelief in the game. I would maybe more call it suspension of value system. It's not going to be that deep. People will feel that it's a surface thing. And lastly, I feel that challenge is actually very precious and that we misuse it. Challenge is one thing that games as a medium can do much more directly and much more extensively than any other medium, right? So challenge is kind of our domain, and we ought to acknowledge that and understand that and treat it as precious, because if we're going to have a place in the world of art alongside other media, we have to play to our strengths and use them effectively. And we're not doing that right now. We're wasting it, and it's kind of a shame.
So what does challenge mean for an adventure game? Some people point to the aha moment you have when you figure out a puzzle. But I don't think this is quite right, or at least it doesn't fully capture the spirit of what we were after. I think this misleads us into thinking we need harder puzzles, which takes us down that road of Sierra logic or dream logic. For me, the joy is those times when the game is implicitly asking something of me, but not explicitly telegraphing what I need to do. I am allowed to step up and inject my own thought process, my own creativity, and my own personality, and express it in the game or the puzzle.
Now, I've used the word challenge a lot, and that may make you think that I'm calling for, games must all be very difficult and frustrating to the player and stuff. I don't think that's true. A game doesn't need to be difficult, right? It just needs to be interesting. It needs to convince the player that their actions matter. And instead of presenting things as like a violent, you better live up to this kind of challenge, or a hard, are you smart enough to figure out this puzzle kind of challenge, you can have things that are more like invitations, right? Open requests that the players step up to a certain level of performance, for which there is a consummate reward if they choose to meet that level of performance, right?
To make this a little more concrete, let's talk about the text parser versus point-and-click interfaces and dialogue selections.
So would you say the move from parsers to point-and-click was a dumbing down of the genre?
I felt that way, absolutely. Absolutely. There's no more room really for creativity in coming up with solutions. If there's only 3 or 4 cursors, then sure, you're going to click on everything on the screen. You're not going to think of anything particularly clever to do. You're not going to think of any...
The parser interface allowed solutions to come from your own volition. Maybe the puzzle wasn't that hard, but the fact that you came up with it instead of sleepwalking through it by clicking on what's presented to you makes a difference in that joy of achievement. The difference is like watching somebody work out a math problem versus doing the problem yourself. Dialogue selection options suffer from the same drawbacks. I am presented with options to talk about rather than coming up with them myself. I am being led instead of driving the conversation. Additionally, what if I want to say something that isn't in the list? And remember this problem, where we have no say in when, what, or how the conversation is done? While more specific items help avoid the problem of talking about things I don't want to hear about right now, there's still a fundamental problem. Chekhov's gun. Remove everything that has no relevance to the story. If you say in the first chapter that there is a rifle hanging on the wall, in the second or third chapter it absolutely must go off. If it's not going to be fired, it shouldn't be hanging there. The idea of Chekhov's gun is that the audience builds an expectation that the gun will be used, and they will focus their attention on it. If it is not used, the audience will be disappointed and will be critical of why it was there. When we present the player with dialogue options, we are now leading the player to believe that this item is important via Chekhov's gun. This compels the player to pick the option whether they were really interested in the information or not. In addition, many games, including Sierra games, have made this problem worse by requiring you to talk about certain things in order to advance in the game. In Gabriel Knight 1, you must ask your grandmother about your family in order to unlock the cemetery on your map. In Quest for Glory 4, Asking the Burgomeister about the Adventurers Guild will get you the key to unlock the door. I am now incentivized to pick every dialogue option, regardless if I'm interested or not. So I am back to the original problem, that I have to go through dialogue that I genuinely may not be interested in. And Ganon noticed among Sierra's final improvements to their text parser was Ask About, which preemptively solved these problems. The player is now able to drive the conversation instead of being led, and can get specific information instead of general exposition, and do so on their own timetable. The player is engaged and now wants the information, otherwise the player wouldn't have asked about it. Furthermore, it implicitly asks the player to step up and participate, and rewards them with the appropriate feedback. It also allowed for subtlety. Quest for Glory, being the only series that was planned out to be multiple parts from the beginning, used this very effectively with the backstory of Arana, a missing enchantress who created magical gardens around the world. She doesn't appear till the 4th game, but breadcrumbs about her were hidden throughout the first 3 games. Players were not beaten with forced exposition about Arana. You could pass through the games without ever learning anything, but for the attentive, that wanted to know, were rewarded with clues and lore. But I'm not oblivious to the problems the parser had, nor do I think we're going back, especially as input systems continue moving away from the keyboard. The problems of the parser in general are well known and easily lampooned.
I see I was put to bed. It's afternoon and I overslept. What shall I do now? I'm gonna write, get out of bed. Don't know what out is. What shall I do now? Wake up. Don't know how to wake something. Go. I also need a direction. Go right. Don't know what right is. Go left. Don't know what left is. Eat pillow. Yuck. Okay, so I ate the pillow? I didn't expect that. Get up. I'm in a bedroom. Closed window, brass bed, north. Okay. Go north? What shall I do now? Okay, so I went north? What did that do? Go east? Okay, what shall I do now? Go east again? Use 1 or 2 words only. Oh, okay, I'll give you 2 words.
Still, with the advances in other areas like chatbots and technology like IBM Watson or Apple Siri, it feels like we could be doing something better today. I don't know if voice is the solution, and I can't help feeling like we need some kind of breakthrough in input systems, but it is interesting to think about. It wouldn't have to be perfect, but it needs to be good enough that the user is no longer fighting the system, and ideally be able to get in some kind of game zen with it. We can turn to science fiction for ideas of what this might look like.
Uncrop. Wait, what's that? Frame left? That card. Zoom in. Swallow, pick up, 3 o'clock. Must be his taxi. Bet his address is on the other side. Pull out. Stop. Wait, I've got an idea. Track in. Stop. Enhance reflection. Need another reflective surface to get back across the street. Zoom. Pan right. See if there are any water droplets on that lamppost. Got one. Thanks, Fido. Zoom 80. Enhance reflection. Stop. Rotate 170. Zoom 220. What's that? Flop. That's the taxi driver. There's the business card. Zoom 260. Rotate 90 degrees. Track in. Swallow's business address. Sir, wouldn't it have been quicker to look him up in the phone book?
So now, let's bring everything together and walk through a real example of what I think represents a good puzzle. And to do this, we need not go any further than the original King's Quest 1. So, spoiler alert, I'm going to cover one of the major puzzles of the game, getting the magic chest. Skip ahead 4 minutes if you don't want to hear this. Please note, I'm saying good, not perfect. It is easy to get distracted with flaws, but the real value here is focusing on the positive. This account is actually based on real-world conversations I've had with other players, since we didn't have the internet to compare notes. In a group of 5 people, I asked this 2-part question. How did you deal with the dwarf, and how did you get the chest from the giant? The completionist. I bypassed the dwarf by using the beanstalk because I figured out the gnome's name.
Yeah, right.
The pragmatist. I couldn't figure out the gnome's name, so I had to climb the stairs. I got mugged by the dwarf on the way up. Oh well, treasures grow on trees in Daventry. The inventory junkie. Me too, but I befriended the elf and I got the ring of invisibility, and I figured out I could use it to slip past the dwarf. The world observer. I realized the fairy godmother protection spell might protect me. And it worked. The accountant. Ha! I beat the system. I went up the stairs before I got anything of value, so I had nothing worth stealing. Question 2. So what about the giant? The completionist. I got the magic shield before I came. I was taunting the giant when he fell asleep. How do you like that? The pragmatist. I kept running to avoid the giant while I was trying to figure out what to do. I got lucky, and he fell asleep. The inventory junkie. My ring of invisibility also works on the giant, and he'll fall asleep. The world observer. The fairy godmother protection spell also works against the giant. The accountant. I used the slingshot. I knew the dwarf wouldn't steal my pebbles. So there are a lot of interesting things about this puzzle. First, this puzzle is made up of multiple parts and has multiple solutions. It isn't some trivial dialogue selection puzzle where you pick a path. 1, 2, 3, A, B, C, red, green, blue. Nor is it your typical inventory puzzle. It is not spelled out by the game, and it is intricate enough such that the player has to step up and proactively try things, not simply react when prompted. In addition, the dwarf challenge was an additional opportunity for players to step up beyond what was explicitly called for. The game never tells you you can beat the dwarf and doesn't block progress of the game. And yet, without prompting, most of the players here rose to the challenge by themselves. And every one of these people took pride in their accomplishment. While there are a finite number of solutions, there is still enough room for each person to draw from their own creativity and effort. Each solution also potentially reflects some kind of nature or personality about the player: the crafty accountant, the perfectionist completionist, the focused pragmatist, etc. Another interesting thing is that this puzzle can work just as well for either the text parser or point-and-click interface. I'm not claiming this is always going to be true, but in this case it shows it is possible. Also notice that to express this story, we didn't need dialogue or other traditional narrative techniques. The story was expressed through the puzzle gameplay of the player's actions and decisions. And this may be a good example of puzzles driving story instead of the other way around. The beans push us to grow a beanstalk. The key pushes us to go to the cave door and initiate the dwarf puzzle. King's Quest I actually missed a lot of story opportunities dealing with the consequences of how you deal with the dwarf and the giant. But you can see easy story opportunities created by the fallout of your decisions from the puzzles. For example, if you lose a treasure to the dwarf, why not have a side quest to try to break into the dwarf's home and steal it back? Does the giant have a family? What happens to them if you kill him? How did the dwarf know you were coming? Or why was the dwarf up there? Is he involved with the chest plot? Why does the giant have the chest? Is he working for somebody? So, what can we say about King's Quest 2015? Unfortunately, with the exception of one puzzle, I can't say that any of the puzzles asked something of me or allowed me to express my own creativity and personality. The majority of the puzzles were the simple use object A in location B variety. Worse, we had a handful of the choose the selection path prompts, which asked virtually nothing of the adventurer.
You're not discovering a world. You're being taken on a tour. You're no longer a pioneer adventurer. You're a guest at Disneyland.
But I said there was one exception. I mentioned the adventure with the Chaka earlier, and the designers tried to make this the emotional and dramatic high point of the episode. So obviously this is where you put your best puzzles. So here we are, enjoying the first proper King's Quest adventure game in 20 years with amazing production values and scale, and now we have to play a friggin' sliding block puzzle.
Good thing you didn't know about this when you bought the game.
Okay, the puzzle isn't that bad, but for a puzzle in such a prominent position, it would be nice for something that actually took advantage of the adventure game genre. So spoiler alert, the exception is a very small, almost throwaway puzzle related to fetching the wheel for the merchant. Jump ahead 2 minutes if you don't want to hear this. All the townsfolk are out watching the parade when you find the empty town. Each shop has something that can be used as a wheel. You grab one of these wheels and head back for the merchant. But what about paying? Well, if you're observant, you'll see that each store has a pan for tips. So at your discretion, you may decide to leave money for the wheel or not. And of course, there are real consequences for your actions or inactions. So here are some interesting things about this puzzle. This puzzle does not need additional dialogue or narration to set up, and can be inferred completely through the situation and setting. This puzzle implicitly asks the user to step up and both notice the scenery for the tip jar and pay for the wheel. There is no explicit, blunt messaging. The game does not block your progress. You may miss this puzzle completely, or consciously decide not to leave a tip. The consequences are handled well too. The robbed merchant will begin locking their door, so every time you visit, you must wait for them to unlock the door. Unlike another similarly structured puzzle in the game, the consequences are not just limited to superficial visuals and dialogue that you may not pay attention to or care about. In this case, you feel the consequences through gameplay by the increased amount of time it takes to see the merchant. Honestly, I was almost oblivious to the fact that this was a puzzle because Sierra had already preconditioned me so intensely. It's a Sierra game. Of course you always pay. But then I saw this.
Our friend Nicole, who was like our contact for this, was like, "Aw, you're the only person this entire day who actually left coins."
And not entire day, the whole of E3 in its entirety that has actually left money for stealing something.
As I was finishing up this review, I ran across this recent quote from designer Ron Gilbert of LucasArts fame, working on his next game, Thimbleweed Park. Classic adventure games were really about puzzles. Puzzles drive everything, and it seems that modern adventure games tend to get too lost in story, and puzzles are just something tacked onto that. So I'm not sure if I should feel vindicated that I'm on the right path, or if I should feel silly for taking a half hour to say what he said in 2 sentences.
This explanation is referred to as overkill.
Anyhow, I said this wouldn't be your typical review.
Well, he did warn you.
However, I do want to say a few things about stuff you would find in a normal review, so we'll wrap things up with this final leg,